I've taken on a rather large subject, but I promise not to talk for too long, but my topic today is Bonnard and modernism. So I think we can begin. It has been 60 years since Pierre Bonnard was buried in a quiet cemetery a few hundred yards from his beloved house in Le Cannet. 60 years during which this most elusive of artists has been the subject of critical appraisal and reappraisal. We continue to rediscover Pierre Bonnard. Art history texts have simply ignored his place in modernism. As Jack Flam eloquently argues in his catalog essay, Bonnard just didn't fit into the master narrative of revolutionary movements in French art. Fauvism, Cubism, Surrealism, and early conceptualism. Editing him from that restive dialogue in the early decades of the 20th century was the obvious solution. And yet the development of that dialogue was not seamless. There were excursions, great artists whose aesthetics deviated from the mainstream, and Bonnard's trajectory was on one such lateral path. The closest Bonnard would come to a place in history among the avant-garde was, of course, as a member of the Nabi, a short-lived association of Parisian artists who emulated the revolutionary Gauguin, embraced the decorative in painting, and shunned academicism. Bonnard spent several productive years in the orbit of the Nabi, achieving success as a printmaker, illustrator, and draftsman, and as the recipient of important decorative commissions for illustrious collectors as far afield as Moscow. Indeed, Bonnard's foray into book illustration produced one of the most arresting livres de peintre, resonating to this day for its daring lithographic evocations of contemporary French verse. In page after page, he wraps the eroticism of Verlain's Parallèlement in seductive illustration, fully disregarding any expectation of graphic boundaries. Bonnard would do the same 38 years later when the publisher Thériault invited him to design the cover of his art magazine Verve, the only lithograph. This is the only lithograph in our current exhibition. Bonnard has once again integrated lettering and imagery. His Le Cannet dining room table appears upended, as in so many of the late paintings. Its objects want to leave our field of vision while the letters V-E-R-V-E take center stage. Bonnard is using the very same pictorial devices in lithography that he does in paintings of the later period. The Nabi artists went their separate ways around 1900. Bonnard was only 33 years old. He would spend the next 47 years searching for the right expression as a painter. Pierre Bonnard was by nature quiet, taciturn, and always modest. Self-promotion was just not in his genes. He had a steadily remunerative relationship with his Paris gallery, Bernheim Jeune, but he was perfectly content to let them handle matters of commerce. And while he may not have been in the forefront of new painting in the early decades of the 20th century, far from it, in fact, he nevertheless had a steady following of collectors, some of whom bought his pictures in great numbers. Duncan Phillips, the American collector, whose collection, of course, is now represented by the Phillips collection in Washington, discovered Bonnard in 1925, and in the decades to come, he would collect some 17 paintings and just as many works on paper for his own private collection, noting later in life, quote, "Our very personal collection of Bonnard's work is in itself a recognized memorial to his genius. With us, Bonnard is at home." Phillips spoke these affectionate words to the president of the Royal Academy in London in 1964, where 2 years later, Bonnard would be the subject of a grand and expensive exhibition. Bonnard's critical acclamation in America saw no parallel in Paris. Paris was caught up with Braque and Picasso, with the deconstruction of the pictorial image through synthetic and analytic cubism, with art that sparked discourse and controversy, with Guillaume Apollinaire and André Breton, with an aesthetic often politically and satirically charged. Bonnard's preoccupation with the slow process of painting and his choice of a subject matter drawn from daily life cast him as a conservative, his work an anachronism. Consider the fact that when Bonnard was born in 1867, oh goodness, I didn't show you these earlier. I'm so sorry. I neglected to show you an iconic Picasso, and that's a Braque, and that's a Picasso. Consider the fact that when Bonnard was born in 1867, Bouguereau and Cabanal were the darlings of the French salon. For centuries, art had been accountable to a rigidly upheld formal evaluation, accountable to the vaunted legacy of the French Academy. Impressionist plein air painting and bravura brushwork were seen as radical and unprecedented. The artists of Impressionism were repeatedly snubbed in the public arena. 8 years later, at the close of Bonnard's long career, the narrative of French art had vastly elasticized. By this I mean that artists and writers, poets and filmmakers had joined the modernist debate on terms philosophical, aesthetic, and polemical. French culture basked in the irreverence of a new generation, which brazenly burst the boundaries of convention, whether with paint on canvas, verse on letterpress paper, or even celluloid in film. In the ferment of Parisian art circles, Pablo Picasso was the most powerful voice. No other artist would have such a profound influence on the course of modernism. Together with George Braque, his Cubist paintings and collage introduced a wholly new visual language into the narrative of French art, resonating everywhere in Paris and indeed elsewhere in the Western world. Picasso was the measure by which contemporary critics gauged an ever-changing, fast-paced cultural climate. His narrative paintings pulsed with political symbolism. He was deeply engaged in contemporary life, and his paintings gave piercing expression to his role as a crusading force against fascism. Guernica represented Picasso's vilification of Franco and the devastations of war. While Picasso was readying Guernica for exhibition in the Spanish pavilion of the 1937 Exposition Universelle in Paris, Pierre Bonnard was quietly discovering the mysteries of layering color pigments on canvas as metaphors for his sensations. Bonnard may have been socially and aesthetically removed from the vanguard painters circling Picasso, but he was by no means blind to their powers of invention. He is quoted as having said that Cubism left him hanging in mid-air. He quietly wondered whether the art of painting would survive the polemicizing of contemporary art. Universally admired, Pablo Picasso was fully aware of the impact of his voice, both as a painter and as a critic of his own generation. Never content to rest on his powers, he inveighed against contemporaries whose art was anathema to his own way of painting. "That's not painting what he does," he said of Pierre Bonnard. Using passionate language and categorical arguments, Picasso seized every opportunity to discredit Bonnard as a painter. Even in posterity, Picasso disseminated criticism through François Gillot's 1964 publication, Life with Picasso. To Gillot, he elaborated his opinions. "Bonnard never goes beyond his own sensibilities," Picasso said. "He doesn't know how to choose. When Bonnard paints a sky, perhaps he first paints it blue, more or less the way it looks. Then he looks a little longer and he sees some mauve in it, so he adds a touch or two of mauve just to hedge. Then he decides that maybe it's a little pink too, so there's no reason not to add some pink. The result is a potpourri of indecision. If he looks long enough, he winds up adding a little yellow instead of making up his mind what the sky really ought to be. Painting cannot be done that way. Painting isn't a question of sensibility. It's a matter of seizing the power, taking over from nature, not expecting her to supply you with information and good advice." Well, to those of you who know Bonnard and the slow, idiosyncratic process by which he came to achieve his paintings, you will recognize that Picasso was dead wrong. Color in Bonnard's late painting is not about painting a sky blue or mauve prompted by information from nature. Color in a late Bonnard is not keyed to the advice of nature, using Picasso's own words. Color in a late Bonnard is not bound by the palette of the literal world. Color in a late Bonnard is not tied to the chromatic relationships that capture the eye at the motif. What Picasso mocked as a potpourri of indecision was for Bonnard, quote, the logic of color. Bonnard searched for color echoes throughout the rectangle of his canvas, relating the red-pink of the interior to the red-pink of the sky, the yellow of the wall to the yellow of an arm, the purple of a shadow to the purple of a model's face. The entire surface of a Bonnard painting is animated by these color relationships, dialogues in paint that one can only trace through prolonged looking. Bonnard spoke of color as logic and drawing as sensation, reversing their association for Cézanne and the Impressionists, for whom color emerges from the senses, while drawing is an intellectual pursuit. In an interview in 1945, Bonnard spoke very candidly of color and painting. When one covers a surface with colors, one should be able to try any number of new approaches, find a never-ending supply of new combinations of forms and colors, which satisfy emotional needs. Bonnard resisted working from direct observation, declaring that painting from the object was too distracting. He spoke of floundering before the object, of surrendering to the subject, and of losing his original thoughts. Painting directly from life, after all, denied Bonnard the intrusion of memory and time, and it was the memory of that experience, filtered through time, that fueled his inventive powers. Bonnard turned to drawings as the laboratory for his investigations of imagery. On small sheets of paper, some no larger than a few inches tall, he laid out for himself in graphic marks the grids of his rectangles, the colors of his palette, the pose of his models. Many of those investigations were encompassed in the diaristic layout of tiny pocket daybooks, 4 of which are in the current exhibition. That this artist could transform the tiny pencil marks in his diary into large, complex canvases of sumptuous and surprising color is truly extraordinary. It is possible that Bonnard's pencil marks, the zigs and zags, flecks and scribbles, represented some sort of very personal typology keyed to color hues. This shorthand lexicon triggered the memory of color as a template for the laying in of paint on canvas. Bonnard often conflated imagery from several drawings in a painting. He kept his working drawings with him all his life. The timing of a drawing had little bearing on when it might be used in a painting. The artist also inscribed color notes in the diaries and elsewhere on larger studies. Drawings were so important to Bonnard, for they enabled the translation of his experience of his subject into color. If we observe in Bonnard a spectrum of hues evocative of the experience of color, yet separated in time, we begin to understand the importance of color as a metaphor for past sensations. Memory, imagination, invention, and distance all contribute to the process of painting in Bonnard's studio. He tacked his unstretched canvases to its large wall, interiors, still lifes, bathers, and landscapes, all side by side. He worked very slowly, often advancing several canvases at once. Bonnard never felt comfortable closing a picture. There was always some small revision that prolonged the process. If we think of the omnipresent Picasso as an artist of intense emotionality and theatricality, an artist who brought his paintings to complete resolution through a language of signs and symbols, both complex and highly linear, an artist who cared less for color relationships than its tonal extremes, an artist for whom form and color carried narrative value, well, then we come to understand his difficulties with Bonnard. And yet, Picasso's misreading of Bonnard was so clearly articulated and so emphatically delivered that one can only wonder whether Picasso felt some kind of rivalry at a very visceral level. Bonnard might have fared better had Picasso saved his contemptuous remarks for François Gillot's memoirs. Such was not the case. All of Paris heard Picasso, and critics marched to his word. One of the most damning critiques of Bonnard was published by Picasso's good friend Christian Zervos in his magazine Cahiers d'Art shortly after Bonnard's death in 1947. Its title read, "How to Explain the Growing Reputation of Bonnard's Work." The answer followed in the text. When carefully examined, it is obvious that this reverence is shared by men who know nothing about the grave difficulties of art and cling above all to what is facile and agreeable. Henri Matisse took umbrage and sent an angry rebuttal to Zervos, scribbled on the cover of the magazine, quote, "Yes, I certify that Pierre Bonnard is a great painter today and assuredly in the future." Not satisfied with his first defense of Bonnard, Matisse wrote to Zervos again, I cannot understand why you went after Bonnard. I know Bonnard. I have been watching him for half a century. I was never able to discover the depths of his expression, even though it is constructed from materials I know well. While this deeply felt emotion may have been prompted in part by the affection Matisse felt for Bonnard, the remark has had lasting effect, and it is often cited in any discussion of Bonnard and French modernism. In fact, Bonnard and Matisse grew very close during the war years when France was occupied and food was rationed. They exchanged touching letters, beautifully translated by the poet Richard Howard, our third speaker today. Matisse was a resident of the Hotel Regina in Nice, while Bonnard lived alone in Le Canet. He wrote to Matisse of his loneliness without Marthe, his companion of 50 years, who died in 1942. Matisse urged Bonnard to join him at the hotel, but Bonnard couldn't imagine leaving his own surroundings, his own reality, the interiors of that pink house on the hill down which olive, orange, and almond trees cascaded in terraces to the Mediterranean. Bonnard and Matisse exchanged paintings in the spring of 1946. Matisse lent Bonnard 2 full-figured females. In response, Bonnard wrote to him, "Your 2 pictures decorate, yes, that's the word, decorate my dining room, against an ochre background that becomes them, especially the woman with the necklace. The red there is wonderful late in the afternoon. By day, it is blue that takes the lead. What an intense light the colors have, and how they vary with the light. I make discoveries every day," Bonnard said. In Bonnard's reigning years, there was a resurgence of interest both in his art and in his quiet, noble persona. The world must have known that he was slipping away. The great photographers Henri Cartier-Bresson and Bresson traveled to Le Canet from Paris to photograph him at his house, Le Bosquet. Prominent French magazines devoted entire issues to his art, commissioning writers, friends, and critics to offer a final tribute to an honorable life of painting. Even Clement Greenberg, here in New York, published an article in The Nation. In January 1947, only days before the artist died, he seems to have understood Bonnard's quiet investigations. He wrote, "Bonnard, for his part, has worked toward the abstract in a slower and, in a sense, more organic way than did the Cubists. It is precisely this concentration on his stuff, on juice and matter, that seems to have led Bonnard to paint more and more abstractly. The greater the attention to pigment and brushstroke, the less becomes the concern with the original data of the subject in nature." End quote. For all those who appreciated Bonnard, there were louder echoes of dissent. To many, he was just a hedonist. His reputation would never shake its association with the joie de vivre qualities of Impressionism. The preface to a Bernheim Jeune sale catalog of 1946 described how one feels while looking at Bonnard's paintings. "We feel a delicious, slow rhythm of life, an abandon of all ambition, an acceptance of the ephemeral in things, lessons of humility and of happiness." Well, if Bonnard's gallery of 46 years chose to market him as a painter of facile charm and careless abandon, offering up narratives of comfort and happiness and sweet ephemera, then we understand a bit better why the narrative of modernism found no room for his art. Clearly, Bernheim Jeune pitched to an audience of well-to-do French, many of whom bought what they viewed as simply decorative and colorful. Writing in 1949 for a Zurich publication, the art historian Jean Lemarie spoke of Bonnard as showcasing the best of Impressionism, that creative instinct while in nature, he wrote. John Rewald called Bonnard the successor and the last survivor of Impressionism in MoMA's 1948 exhibition catalog. Rewald wrote that if one could speak of, quote, the exquisiteness of banality, end quote, Bonnard's paintings would embody it. Even the artist's family talked of the comforting qualities of his paintings. Writing in 1953, his nephew, Charles Terrasse, noted the salutary effect of those pleasurable paintings on a war-ravaged Europe. Perhaps all these links to Impressionism wouldn't seem so vexing were it not for the fact that true Impressionism, groundbreaking Impressionism, predated by 50 years Bonnard's investigations of color and light. To have called him a latter-day Impressionist was certainly by implication disdainful, for it was stated in reaction to an endorsement of contemporary conceptual styles. In a word, Bonnard had missed the boat. Bonnard's own personal rapport with Impressionism is a complicated one. He once described himself to Matisse as the last of the Impressionists. While in some respects there was a commonality of instinct and purpose, in the end, Bonnard's process of brushing colored oils on canvas was wholly his own, and the chromatic results were infinitely more daring than the tonal painting of Impressionism. Quote, "When my friends and I wanted to pursue the researches of the Impressionists," Bonnard said, "we sought to surpass them in their naturalistic impressions of color." He continued, "Art is not nature. There was also much more to be had from color as a means of expression," end quote. The symbolist poet Mallarmé spoke admiringly of Manet and the Impressionists as having the ability to convey in paint the delight one experiences upon seeing an everyday object for the very first time. Keeping the same objects in a continual state of flux is analogous to what Mallarmé does with words. Bonnard, too, was drawn to the momentary, to objects in flux, to that first visual experience. In an often quoted remark, and one so apt in the context of our present exhibition, he freely confessed that he hoped to capture in his paintings what one sees on entering a room all of a sudden. One sees everything, Bonnard said, and at the same time nothing. And yet, while the Impressionists sought to capture their own sensations in paint at the very moment of experiencing imagery, sur le motif, Bonnard, as I have mentioned, resisted working directly from observation. He relied instead on a collection of drawings stored in the studio. Drawing played a more profound role in the process of painting for Bonnard than it did, say, for Monet or Sisley, whose landscapes developed from actual contact. There are wonderfully evocative tales of the adventures of Impressionist painters as they endeavored to paint from nature. To paint women in the garden, Monet jerry-rigged a studio outdoors. In his words, "I really painted this work on the spot and after nature, an unusual process at the time. I had to dig a hole in the ground, a sort of ditch, to gradually lower my canvas." Daubigny, Charles-François Daubigny, fashioned a floating studio for river excursions along the Seine. Following his lead, Monet did the same. As we come to a better understanding of Bonnard's technique as a painter, we realize that he moved well beyond Impressionism in his color experiments. The Impressionists painted tonally, straight from optical data. Bonnard, working from imagination and the memory of imagery, gave color a far greater role in his paintings. One could even argue that for Bonnard, color and its color harmonies throughout the rectangle of the canvas became the overriding metaphor for the expression of his experience. Color in his late paintings transcends the descriptive content of Cézanne. It moves well away from the local color that we see in a Cézanne still life. In the late masterpieces of our present exhibition, color becomes the subject, the vehicle of light, and the means by which we enter the paintings with our eyes. Using hot and cold hues, Bonnard guides the eye very deliberately on a path through the positive and negative spaces of his complex canvases. One cannot stress enough how important it was for the artist to find the image in paint and to find the boundaries of his rectangle. His process was very slow. He worked on several paintings at once, as I have said, tacking unstretched canvases to the studio wall. It is also this very idiosyncratic, very personal approach to painting that separates him from the great giants of Impressionism. In fact, Bonnard's approach comes closer to artists who followed him in the great narrative of modernism than to those who paved the way for its many permutations. We now know that in the narrative of mid-20th century modernism, Bonnard's legacy resonated broadly. He was an influence in our country on the painters of abstract expressionism. His color, his surfaces, and the overall treatment of his canvases found expression in the work of Rothko, Clifford Still, and later Diebenkorn and Guston. If Bonnard took everyday objects in familiar surroundings and found ways through a language of color and light to reinvent their presence in paint, then Rothko leapt on his legacy, freeing color from image and subject and figuration. Rothko's canvases of plainer color and light and their vibrant interrelationships owe a liberating debt to Bonnard. Rothko, too, pulls light from color and the physicality of paint. Light emerges from color sensations, from color memory. Just as Bonnard often painted deeper colors over lighter ones, so too did Rothko introduce these value relationships to imply, like Bonnard, a pulsing light beneath the surface. In Diebenkorn, We recognize the kindred use of Bonnard's irregular spatial roots, the use of the edge of the rectangle, and a wide range of painterly gestures and marks describing forms. In Diebenkorn's early abstractions, as in Rothko's paintings, color bars and rounded rectangles of different sizes permeate the composition. A debt to Bonnard also appears in the figurative works of Diebenkorn. When Diebenkorn introduces figures into his richly painted canvases, he melds the figure with its environment, still allowing his model to carry an emotional content. The reworking of Diebenkorn's images within the rectangle reminds us of Bonnard's search for proportions in his late interiors. When one looks at the chunky big forms of Bonnard's fruit or models' heads, when one looks at the way he stacks form against form, when one thinks of the anthropomorphic nature of his objects, Philip Guston comes to mind. Guston's late paintings are richly colored, often using whites and blacks with reds and greens, evoking late Bonnard. Guston's painterly approach and his self-referentiality echo Bonnard's visions. In conclusion, returning to Bonnard's own later years, it is truly remarkable that an artist surrounded by war, caring for a sick wife, and facing his own mortality could make his pleasures as a painter so extraordinary. Living with the day-to-day problems of ordinary life, he transforms his world into the enlightenment of color, which in turn becomes the light of possibilities. Thank you.